Kiddo, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Welcome to our 206th Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. There's definitely a bit of background noise going on, so if you're able to mute your microphones, that will be fantastic. It's a great pleasure to have Patrick Noose presenting today from the Halle Institute for Economic Research, Captured by Conflict, Examining the Consequences of War on the Board. Just before he starts, just to flag up that we are, well, I've not got my background on yet, but we are hosted, as always, by the University of Reading, and we are sponsored as a seminar series by the Sports Economics Review. Recently listed on Scopus, so you can find your favorite economics journal on Scopus now, listed, and a great outlet for your sports economics or more broader economics manuscripts that use sport data. What else to say? We've now got a full schedule running through to Christmas of talks, which is exciting, and there's a couple of conferences along the way. In the schedule, I always try and include the conferences that I'm aware of. If you have a conference that you're organising between now and Christmas and would like me to flag it up, please do let me know. The one that I will flag up again that I might have mentioned last week. If you're interested, and if you happen to attend, we had a conference last February at Oldham Athletic, Boundary Park Stadium. And that was a finance, history and analytics conference. We're in the process of organising the second football analytics and finance conference, which will be on December the 9th at Oldham Athletic. In February, I was able to bill that with going to a National League football match, which was the 5th division of English football. I can bill the conference on December the 9th by saying you can go to a 4th division game of English football. That evening, Oldham play Walsall in Sky Bet League 2. And if you look at the reminder notification today, you'll see that conference listed on December the 9th. If you're interested, do make a note of that. And more information will come out in due course. Patrick, you've got an hour in which to talk. Do you want to take questions as you go along, or would you prefer to park questions at the end?
Yeah, questions during the talk is completely okay. Should be able to handle it.
So if you have questions, obviously raise your hand and ask Patrick your question. Patrick, the floor is yours.
All right. First of all, thanks, James, for the opportunity to present our paper, and thank you everyone else for joining us today for the presentation of our project, Captured by Conflict, Examining the Consequences of War on the Board, which is joint work with Maria Cobell from City University London, Julia Engel from Keele University, and Santiago Sanchez-Pages from King's College London. And the paper is motivated by the second full-scale attack from Russia on the Ukraine, which was the second within a decade. And with this invasion, a lot of questions arise about what's going on in the country, how this attack is affecting people, the economy, and basically everyone in Europe. We were particularly puzzled about how civil population is affected by this war, simply because it's quite difficult to find any research about this. We find research about how people living in a war zone are affected in their political preferences, in their risk-taking, etc., decades later. Or we have research on soldiers, on post-traumatic stress syndromes and refugees, but little is known about how war affects the civil population in the country itself. And that's where our research questions comes from. What are the real-time effects of war on cognitive performance of the civil population? There's a pretty good reason why there is no real research about this, because we have three challenges in the analysis of this. First, we need access to a civil population in the war zone, and to say it quite bluntly, we have different or more important things to do during a war than sending a bunch of people, serving people about their well-being, simply because, well, every resource available should go into the support of civil population. Even when we would be able to do it from a logistically or ethical perspective, we would want to observe people in regular occurring tasks again and again to get a panel dimension and see changes in the behavior over time. And in a constant changing combat landscape, this is pretty difficult, but not impossible. Even when we might be able to reach people, and in the case of the Ukraine war, there are recent surveys about mental health of the civil population. However, it's likely that these results are somewhat biased simply because of people who are actually having mental health issues are less likely to participate in such surveys. So, and ideally, we would like to observe them several times and ask them how they are feeling, etc. And that's basically impossible. Well, thinking about a constant changing combat environment, well, particularly when attacks are going on, when we have a lot of explosions, that's a point in time where it's probably impossible to actually survey enough people to get a representative picture of what's going on in this environment. So our empirical strategy, which tries to solve all those three problems, is to make use of a regularly occurring online chess tournament called Title Tuesday Tournament, which is an online tournament organized by chess.com, where the top 1% of chess players are participating. We have data from April 2020 to September 2023, and we have data of about 1 million games and 40 million single moves within the chess games. And we exploit variation in air alarms and other conflict indicators to see how this changes their cognitive performance within these tournaments. Well, to talk about the data themselves, we have 4 main data sources for this project. First of all, we scraped the chess.com Title Tuesday tournament, where we have information about every player who participated at any point in time in this tournament, but not just who these players are, but we also have every information about the game, not just whether they win or lose. We have the board situation, the concrete state of the board, and every single move they do. In addition, well, to this board, to this placements, we can, well, this allows us to calculate the optimal move and compare it with the actual move everyone did, which allows us at the end to look on the move accuracy of players relative to the computer. In addition to this, now where we have all this information from chess players participating in this tournament, we scraped in addition every other chess activity these players did on chess.com over this sample period, which allows us to merge a bunch of more information, learning about their activity on the platform, how much training they had, and how they performed also outside of the tournaments. For conflict indicators, we use 2 different data sources. First of all, the customized data set about air alarms UA, which maps air alarms, artillery, and explosions all over Ukraine for the entire sample period, and additional information by the armed conflict location and event data, which is an Ukraine conflict monitor, which tries to do similar things as the initial report we are using, but sometimes has different information, and quality and data over time in both these data sets are somewhat different, so we try to work with both of them. Well, about the tournament itself, chess.com Title Tuesday Tournament is a weekly occurring tournament with a cash prize for the top 5 players and for the best female participant. We have data from April 7, 2020 until September 26, 2023. We do not have data before this time period because this tournament was started during the COVID pandemic. Back until this point in time, most chess players participated in in-person tournaments all over the world, and moving quite a lot for that. With the pandemic, this changed, and chess.com tried to use the opportunity to implement this weekly tournament. This tournament is not a classical chess game where people have more than an hour time to think about every single move. It's the 3+1 format, which is called blitz chess. Everyone has 3-minute times for their moves, and for every move they do, they have an additional second. This means compared to classical chess, the accuracy of each move might be lower, but since we have a consistent measure over the 3 years period, and we still have the possibility to look on a consistent and well-calculated measure of cognitive performance. The tournament has a total of about 264 tournaments, and each tournament has 11 rounds. We have about 1 million observations, and the probably most important thing why we're actually using this tournament instead of just data from other chess.com chess players is when you participate in this tournament, you need to have a title in chess, and it's not just enough to claim that you have such a title. You have to register on chess.com, and you have to send chess.com your ID and a certificate that you actually have a title. Only when this happens, you are allowed to participate in this tournament, which has a positive side effect for us is that we have the real names for almost all tournament participants. So to win a prize in the tournament, you have to play with your real name. People can hide their real name, but it's relatively easy for most people to get this information, which means we can learn more about their activities outside the tournament, outside the chess platform, because we can link all this data to data available from the Federal Chess Organization, which provides us with information, for example, where people are living. Okay. For the alarm data or conflict data in more general, we rely mostly on the air alarm data set, which is based on data available from all alarms going on in Ukraine. As every country has sirens and gives an alarm sign when any danger is going on, this is of course also the case for Ukraine. However, during war, such sirens are destroyed relatively fast, meaning that you get not any real information about sirens itself. However, nowadays, it's quite easy to get the same information with a mobile phone. And it's pretty common by now that basically everyone in Ukraine who has a mobile phone has such an alarm app on their mobile phone, providing them with real-time information about any threats. Meaning, as you can see on the right side in the picture, people are informed when there's any danger going on. They get sound effects and everything. So it's in real time when there's any danger, which is an official siren signal, which you would otherwise, in theory, hear somewhere, everyone is immediately informed about it. In addition to that, basically everyone is nowadays using additional channels like Telegram to get detailed information about what's currently going on. So even when it's just the alarm in the first second, here. Even when it's they just have information that there's any danger, through over this Telegram accounts, they get detailed information about what exactly is going on, whether it's a drone attack, whether it's an air alarm because rockets are aimed at Crimea or wherever. And this information are pretty detailed and coming within seconds. And because this information are digitalized and available to everyone, we have access to the same information, all these alarms, for every specific second they are going on until the end. So on average, The number of alarms per region in a week are about 13 alarms, and the average alarm is going for 60 minutes. So there's quite a lot going on. We cover 24 out of 27 regions in Ukraine, which are structured in oblasts, which is comparable to a federal state. And they are quite small given the size of Ukraine, which allows us to match information quite detailed to people. Yeah, Alex, feel free to speak.
Yeah, thank you. Is it really from the beginning that they had this alarm that was specific for each area? Because I think in the beginning they were complaining that the alarm was all over the country, even if the bombs were targeted to a specific area. So correct me if I'm wrong.
Both is true. At the beginning, you first of all had an alarm everywhere that there is immediate danger, simply because the Ukraine government didn't know what was going on. They had to prepare for everything themselves. And it has been pretty common at the beginning that there have been alarms everywhere. However, not everywhere where you get an alarm, this leads actually to an air attack or explosions, etc. This is particularly the case for the first, I think, 5 to 6 months, until October of 2022. In this first 6 months, we had a relatively weak correlation between alarms and explosions. However, there was still a danger. It often just means when there's no explosion going on that Ukraine was able to have a strong enough air defense to make sure that nothing is going to the areas currently at risk. But the quality, that's why we focus on air alarm data actually. These air alarm data have the highest quality compared to other sources we are using, like explosions, which had a relatively low quality over the first 6 months approximately, which is part of the lower correlation. But it can happen that there have been alarms at some point where people were not in immediate danger, particularly during the first few weeks. Good point, thank you. Okay, related to the question, and here we have some insights about the coverage of alarms within Ukraine. So the total number of alarms we observe in our sample on the left side, and on the right side we see the coverage of our chess players and where they are originally located. As you can see, and which is related to the question or comment we just got, the attacks were of course concentrated in specific regions which are close to Russia or already invaded areas of the Ukraine. And these areas were generally more likely to be exposed to alarms as well as explosions, battles, etc. It regularly happens that drones also affect the more safer areas of Ukraine, but we have some area which is where the risk is more concentrated among regions. Well, for our sample, as I said, we have about 1 million game level observations and a bit more than 40 million moves. We identified, based on the FIDE records we have, 217 Ukrainian chess players. And from all this data, we use them as the mainly treated people and exclude in most of the analyses for the main analysis, the first 15 moves, which is about a bit more than 1% of the observations we had, which has 2 reasons. First of all, previous chess papers also excluded the first 15 moves, and we want to make our results comparable to previous measures of cognitive functioning in chess papers. But good argument why you should exclude at least the first few moves is that the chess game opens with a strategic opening, a specific plan of how to develop your pieces, which is trained on such a on such a high level that people do not have to think at all when opening their chess game. Meaning, there's no real cognitive burden of functioning going on during this first period, which makes it less interesting for an analysis. In robustness checks, you can see that this is actually the case and that the first observations do not seem to matter for move accuracy in any way. We restrict our sample further to players. Kines?
Sorry, so if you will say this a bit later, that's fine. But how are you sure again that the players are in Ukraine?
I think I will do it in 3 or 4 slides, but to give a short heads up, we have information from the feeder profile where they are living. And typically when you're playing chess, you're registered in a regional club or a local club where you are participating in tournaments, etc. However, of course, people can of course move over time, and we have some limitations in our data, but we have a quality protocol to check whether people are approximately where we expect them to be. But that's one of the main threats to our identification strategy.
Right.
Okay.
Because immediately when you say this, and is I think about VPN use, especially during war.
Mm-hmm.
That I don't know if you're using IP, but addresses and this type of stuff that's available. But I feel that majority of people, if not all, will be using VPNs.
Yeah, and we unfortunately don't have IP information. Chess.com does not allow us to scrape such information. And even when they have this information, which they probably have, they are not willing to provide us with them. And our protocol is more about, our quality control is more about learning about where people are registered as chess players, where they are reported by the feeder profile where they are living. And we check whether the changed during the war. Particularly in our period, for at least men, there was no possibility that they can leave the country, simply because of the war situation. Leaving the country for men is typically forbidden, which was the case for Ukraine as well. For women, we have probably a higher risk of mobility, what we cannot 100% account for is internal migration within Ukraine, which is probably the biggest problem for our analysis. But yeah, point taken. Okay, we restrict of sample further to people who have multiple appearances in the series that we are actually able to look on within variation of players. And we generally excluded Russian chess players, which have from the analysis, which has the reason that they are affected by the war themselves, but in a different way than the alarms would happen, which means when we just look on the effect of alarms, but there might be conflict effects on Russians as well. We, of course, would have contamination to some degree of the control group, which means we leave them out. The second thing is because of the use of Russian chess players for war propaganda and some misbehavior that took place. For some time, Russian chess players were not allowed to participate in the tournament, which means we would have also a compositional change in the control group. However, as we just heard, due to VPNs usage, etc., a lot of Russian chess players still participated, but at some point in time, the number of Russian chess players in the sample decreased. With all these restrictions, we end up with about 800,000 observation games and about 22 million move observations for our analysis. Yeah, coming to the methodology, we measure cognitive performance with chess data as common in recent economics literature, for example, Engel 2025, which he will, to my knowledge, present in a few weeks in the seminar herself. Bakus et al., Kuhn et al., and another Kuhn et al. Paper. So there recently have been quite a lot of papers trying to use chess data for cognitive performance. So, and what we are doing is using these positions on the board in every chess game and comparing the move a player did with the optimal move a computer tells us the person should do. And this difference in the accuracy is translated in a measure called centipawn loss, so a fraction of a pawn as a metric to look on accuracy. And the higher the centipawn loss is, the worse the move was relative to the computer who would have done the optimal move. And yeah, here we have it in a bit more detail. So we compare the actual move on the board with the optimal move from the computer. We look on the gap in accuracy leading to the centipawn loss, and to make it comparable, like a centipawn 1,000 centipawn loss is comparable to throwing away a queen during a game. And this is the main metric we are using in the following analysis. For the conflict data, I briefly already mentioned them. We're merging our chess player data with conflict data for the Ukrainian participants by their current location on the oblast level. And as we have been asked already, we identify locations of players from the FIDE location data. And afterwards, we double check whether people are actually in Ukraine. So it starts quite simple and on a quite simple way, whether they participated on local tournaments, which you only can do when you are actually still in Ukraine. And at some point, we had a much more detailed stalking protocol, which even looks on social media activities of players, where we get detailed information whether people played in tournaments outside of the Ukraine, whether they were somewhere on vacation for a longer time. And when this was the case, when we originally merged them with alarm data for their original region, we set the alarms to 0 and treat them like they are not living in Ukraine right now, particularly not in the location where they were originally registered. As pointed out, there are two main caveats with that. First of all, we cannot account for internal migration. It can be the case that people who are directly in the front line in a currently occupied or attacked region could move to a more safer space within Ukraine. We are not able to observe this directly unless we are at some point able to convince chess.com to provide us with IP information, which is unfortunately unlikely, but we probably will still try it. Well, the second caveat is that not all conflict indicators are quite precise measures. As I explained for the alarm data, we have quite detailed information which regions or which oblasts were exposed to an alarm and for how many minutes, seconds, etc. For other indicators like explosions, that's less the case. Simply because an alarm can happen in an entire region, that this region is in danger, but an explosion, which is a much more extreme event, is a quite local thing. And it can happen that chess players, which we merge with this explosion data, are on the south of an oblast, but the explosion is on the north. And then they will never be actually treated, and we still treat them like they're exposed to that. So, and the rule of thumb is for this, the more extreme the conflict indicators are, like explosions, battles, fatalities, the more extreme the measure gets, the more local the treatment probably is, and the less reliable is our merging of the data. Meaning, for the main analysis, we definitely only focus on the most reliable measure of air alarms and just look for additional robustness to these alternative measures, which have, as I said, lower quality. Well, finally coming to our model specification, as the main outcome, we use this already mentioned centipawn loss. As treatment, we use the daily changes in alarms, where we, in most cases, separates them between alarms taking place during the day and alarms during the night. Night alarms are defined to take place between midnight and 6 o'clock in the morning, and the day alarms are the remaining alarms. Probably most people would agree that midnight and 6 o'clock in the morning is the most likely window that people actually try to sleep, which makes them a good proxy for night alarms. Well, the treated people are the Ukrainian chess players who are actually located right now in the Ukraine, or located during our sample period. And for our analysis, we use the day-to-day change in alarms, because the level of alarms over several days can be correlated, because alarms are typically coming in waves. And when there's a lot of alarms today, and there have been already a lot of alarms yesterday, we cannot distinguish between an alarm, the effect of an alarm happening today and yesterday, which is why we use a change in alarms on a daily basis. Plus, we control for the alarms, the change in alarms happening for the last week. We do this in all our specifications here, and the results are quite robust even when we leave the 7 control days as lags out. Okay, when we do all this, we can interpret our coefficient as the effect of one additional alarm on the tournament day on the centiphon loss, on the move accuracy of players. Right, yeah, we have this data set provides us with quite a lot of information, and we have several outcomes of interest in our case. While we mainly focus on centiphon loss, we have a lot of alternative ways to measure that. For example, we use the centiphon loss, but censor it to an upper bound of 1000, simply to rule out that all our effects are driven by a handful of extreme stupid moves the player did. In addition of the centiphon loss measure, we look on the probability of people doing a mistake in the game and the blunder probability. So the probability of doing any mistake or quite a strong mistake as a binary outcome. In addition, we have a bunch of other side outcomes which we are interested in, which is also relevant to learn about the mechanisms taking place. For example, tournament participation itself, probability of quitting a tournament, the riskiness of the opening, and other chess.com activity, as well as their performance in other chess.com activities. So we have a wide range of outcomes even beside the cognitive performance itself. All right, that's the general data and methods. Before I start with the actual results, are there any questions by now? Okay, when this is not the case, let us look at the impact of air alarms on cognitive performance. Okay, here we have the first curve plot, which shows us the cognitive decline by alarm type. First of all, we can see that one additional air alarm leads to an increase in centiphon loss by about 0.5%. 0.5. However, as I mentioned already, we can separate between day and night alarms. Day alarms are the alarms taking place over the entire day, and we can see that they are about 0.4. Every additional alarm leads to a 0.4 increase in centiphon loss, compared to night alarms, we have almost a 3 times higher effect on cognitive decline compared to day alarms. This already indicates that the main driver or the strongest decline of cognitive performance in the chess tournaments happens by sleep deprivation. Just people are interrupted by sleep and are no longer able to concentrate on their chess game. Well, we can also look into much more details, because you can argue, well, an alarm can make noise, and noise during the tournament should be destructive. So we try to separate between alarms that were happening during the tournament and alarms happening shortly before the tournament. And when we do so, we see a weak effect of on cognitive decline for alarms during the tournament. So noise seems to have some sort of effect. But it's not just noise, because we can show that alarms happening, particularly in the 1 hour before the tournament, lead to a cognitive decline on the tournament performance for every of the 11 rounds in the tournament, which is pretty good evidence that it's about stress, sleep deprivation, and not just the noise during the tournament. So things which are particularly relevant for the daily life of the civil population. Of course, we did a bunch of robustness checks, for example, with the alternative accuracy matrix. All 3 metrics, whether we censor the centipoint loss, the error probability, or the blunder probability, provide us with results comparable to the one of the overall centipoint loss. For example, the censoring of the centipoint loss at 1000, we still find the same patterns. In this case, in about 0.2 increase in centipoint loss with every additional day alarm, or alarm in general, 0.1 for day alarms, 0.6 for night alarms. We see the same patterns on a weaker scale compared to the original uncensored measure, which provides us evidence that it's not just a lot of strong, or a few really stupid moves from a bunch of chess players, but it's distributed among doing a lot of stupid moves or a lot of strong blunders and smaller errors people are doing. So it's and their performance decrease over the entire scale of what's going on. Okay, what else? In which phase does the cognitive decline mainly take place? It's over the entire sample. Here we see the centipoint loss, or the effect of all alarms on centipoint loss for the full sample, and step by step excluding 5 more moves. And as you can see, with each additional 5 moves we are excluding, it's from the beginning, from the starting, and from the original opening, the stronger the effect gets, which means, as I already argued before, why we excluded the first moves, because they are just the strategic trained opening, which are not relevant for cognitive functioning. Errors occur more at the time of the game where cognitive performance is actually the relevant point, where fluent intelligence and all this are needed for making the optimal move, and nothing which is trained before, independent of whether people are awake or not. Here we see the same with the original centipoint loss in the censored one, and we see the same pattern as before. The censored centipoint loss has generally weaker effects, but we still see effects, and the same pattern of excluding a few observations shows us again that the strongest decline in performance is happening in the later stages of the game. Here, probably one of the biggest concerns everyone should have when we think about chess performance during a chess tournament and the war is that people are probably not participating in a chess tournament when there's a war going on the street. So when there's an alarm, when there are explosions, people should have better things to do than participating in an online tournament. That's at least what we were thinking, that this is the main threat of identification. However, when we do analysis of the impact of alarms on tournament participation, we see no effect of alarms on tournament participation themselves. We were a bit puzzled about that, but we found a pretty good reason for that, which I will show you in the second half of the results. In addition to the direct effect of alarms, you still can argue that there might be unobservable aspects which are affecting selection into the tournament, which are not directly related to the alarms we are measuring. This is why we use the Heckman selection model to account for such things, and use the range of instruments to use them as an instrument to account for potential selection problems. We use a range of instruments, but the most important instruments are the blitz activity on the chess.com platform in the 2 weeks before the tournament, as well as their performance in the last tournament. So when people participate recently in the tournament and they perform pretty good, they are much more likely to participate next week again. And these instruments help us to learn about the potential selection concerns. And when we test that for all alarms, as well as for the day and night alarms, we still see a decline in cognitive performance comparable to our original coefficients right now with quite wide confidence intervals, which is partly related to the bootstrapping we are doing. Because right now we are resampling for the bootstrapping just 50 times within the nation, which means that we still have relatively low precision, but this confidence intervals get somewhat lower with more repeated sampling, just for making sure that we have data in time for this presentation. We, for now, just use the 50 resamplings compared to the 200 which are on our list. But the most important message is, even when we account for potential selection due to unobservables, we still see alarm effects comparable to our original results, even with wider confidence intervals. Okay, the last remaining concern is the internal migration. People exposed to danger, particularly on the front line, are much more likely to leave leaving the region. Even when they are not able to leave the country, they might move within Ukraine. And there are reports indicating that people move from the front line to the safer haven areas, so areas which are far further away from Russia and the front line. And it's quite difficult to measure how serious the problem is, but the best way we thought about how we can handle that is in splitting our data or our alarms and merging it with the regions where people are from, and splitting that in 3 categories. Category 1 is the previous or currently occupied regions, the ones which are most likely subject to internal migration, so for people leaving the regions. The regions threatened by potential occupation or attacks, which are the regions directly or close to the currently or previously occupied regions, and the safe haven regions, the regions further away from the front line, the regions which were most likely that people might internally migrated to. And when we might do such a sample split and look for heterogeneity analyses, we see that we actually seem to have some problems with the internal migration. We can see the effect at the front line, the occupied regions. We have a relatively small effect of alarms compared to the threatened regions, where it gets a bit stronger, the regions less likely people leaving. And when we just look on the chess players where originally already have been located in the safe area, so the ones least likely to move, we see that our effect size increases by about 5 times the original alarm effects. So it actually looks like there is something going on, and we have problems with merging people correctly with the alarms. However, with the safe haven region, which are also regularly exposed to alarms and explosions, it looks like we have a region where we are able to measure representativeness in the alarm effects. When we also split this into day and night alarms, with the day and night alarms, or all alarms for the safe havens are the yellow ones now, and we generally see when we separate between that, the effects become even stronger. So the day alarms have about a 0.1, a 0.9 effect on centipoint loss, and every additional alarm during night has an almost centipoint loss of 9. So we see particularly night alarms have really, really strong effects, and these patterns are generally in line with what we would observe or expect to observe. All right, these are the main robustness checks. And now we have a bunch of mechanisms we also try to look in. As I mentioned, the conflict indicators, the more extreme they are, the less precise they probably are. And generally, we can see what we would expect, that alarms and explosions reduce cognitive performance. And an indicator that we have problems in the quality of the extreme events is that battles and fatality rates seem to actually make people play better. So there's a chance that we have, for such extreme events, still some sort of selection problem, because there's no logical reason, at least we were able to think about, why alarms and fatalities should increase performance instead of reducing their performance. But generally, at least for the explosions, we can see results going the same direction as we would expect them. Okay. One thing a lot of people had in mind when we were talking about this experiment on this data was, yeah, but at some point people no longer care because they adapt to the situation. They get used to the alarms. And when I recently presented this research on a conference, particularly for research on Ukraine, where a lot of Ukrainian researchers have been as well, they argued it themselves. They said, yeah, I don't no longer care about day alarms or alarms in general, because the alarm is not relevant. The alarm only means I look on Telegram whether it's actually relevant for me to move in the shelter or not. So we try to split our sample in the first year of data and the remaining 30 months of data. And when we do so, we actually see some sort of adaptation effect. So in both sample periods, we see that alarms have an effect on cognitive performance. We see a decline in performance comparable in both sample periods. But we see that day alarms only seem to have an effect in the first year and no longer mattered in the second year, while night alarms have a constant negative effect independent of the sample period, which makes sense when we think about alarms as a factor of stress. At the beginning, when it's unknown, when you're not knowing what's going on, when you're not used to it, these alarms might stress you much more and have an effect on your performance. While when you are starting getting used to it, only night alarms, so things which interrupt your sleep, seem to have an effect on cognitive performance. And these are effects. Not being able to sleep is something even the best people, chess players, probably are not able to distinguish from or save themselves from. Okay. What else is there? We have some additional insights, and we can show that the risk behavior of people changes due to alarms. Gerdes and Gesmark have asked a bunch of professional chess players, part of them also participating in our tournament, to participate in a survey where they have been asked about chess openings and how risky they actually are. So there are safe openings, there are more risky openings, and there are some openings in between. And we use their classification and what this professional chess player told us to use them as an indicator whether people played more risky when they were exposed to alarms, which is something we would expect. And when we do so, we see a small effect on opening behavior. However, this effect is mainly driven by night alarms. We can see that with one additional alarm, there is a 0.1% percentage point higher probability of using a risky opening, which is mainly driven by sleep deprivation. Okay, this effect is pretty consistent even when we look on the alarms over the last days. So it seems like day alarms do not really seem to matter for their opening decisions. while the night alarms over the last days accumulate and make people playing much more risky than they would do in the absence of such alarms. Okay, what else do we have? We also looked on the persistence of alarms, and there we learned something quite interesting, I think. First of all, again, we see the day alarms, or all alarms seem to have an effect, but the alarms over the last days actually seem to improve performance. And when we looked on the day alarms, this effect got even stronger. And with the night alarms decrease cognitive performance, while day alarms over the last days seem to make people actually even playing better than before. So we were wondering how this is possible. And one possibility we were thinking about was that people were during daytime have a lot of alarms going into shelter, and well, they are interrupted by what they did before, and therefore they start playing chess on their phone. So they might have more activity, more training. So this might be the reason why they started performing better. Well, when we look on the count activity, we actually learned that people increased their activity on chess.com with the number of alarms. So the more alarms they are, the more they are playing. And the effect is actually strongest among the blitz games, the format which is most close related to the Title Tuesday tournament. And we can see that the account activity over the last weeks seemed to have no direct performance effects themselves, which was quite puzzling for us. But this left open one more question, but that's the last part of the presentation I will show you in a moment. But first of all, I would like to ask you whether you have any questions directly related to the alarm results. Okay, Kines.
Yeah, what's the, maybe you've addressed this and I missed it, but what's the prevalence of solvers?
Again, please, sorry, I didn't catch it.
What is the prevalence of solvers in online chess?
You mean cheating or something like that?
Right. Yeah.
Ah,
Or
okay,
I mean,
yeah.
at least
Okay.
at least aids, not necessarily
Yeah.
cheating, but move aids
Okay.
essentially.
Okay. In this format, you would talk about cheating in this case. It's in theory, it's possible to have an open computer on your site and let the chess engine run for you and let's it do its optimal move. When this would be the case, we would expect to see no deviation from the optimal move of the computer for these players. Given that we have a blitz format where people have not a lot of time for playing, the time spent on the computer to find the optimal move would probably bring them to a disadvantage in the game, which means there's a non-zero chance that people are cheating or using some help to solve their games, but the probability should be relatively unlikely compared to at least non-blitz formats where anonymous players are being around.
Right. But I mean, my understanding with also some of these is that it's even possible that sure, they don't compute the optimal move, but essentially like are able to try and build in randomness within some of this. So it looks as if it is more of a human.
I wouldn't be sure what the advantage would be when you use the computer and then try to not use the best move. Given that you have to invest a lot of time, even when it's just 3-4 seconds for each move, you would run out of time relatively fast. But as I said, we cannot rule out that everyone is playing without any help. It should be a problem for our identification when the exposure to war or alarms is increasing the take up of such engines. when this is the case, our result should be biased to some degree. Yeah. Okay, and I think we had another question by Evan.
Yeah, sorry, and I'm not sure if I missed this or if you're going to come to it anyway, but my question really is, if there are these alarm effects in the night, then surely we should expect some substitution activity also by chess players. So I don't know if you said that they then would play less at night, or they would somehow substitute away from this, because the returns to playing at night during air raids is lower.
I haven't answered it yet, but this will be the last part of the presentation. I think I have a good answer for you with that.
Okay,
where we think, but to give a short answer related to that, well, when it's only about training, then you would argue that the returns during night are definitely lower, yeah. And you would move to day alarms at daytime to play. I would agree with that. We found out that this is not the main reason why people play chess in this moment, but I will come to it soon. Thank you. Okay, and Stefan was, I think, another question.
Sorry, that's just.
Sorry, I think it's me, Patrick, that you were asking for. It's Richard here. So I think you're reasonably safe on the point that was raised earlier about cheating in chess. Chess.com put a lot of effort into monitoring that, and there's severe reputational damage for anybody who gets caught. They're title players. So I think the chess community feels reasonably safe in terms of cheating online these days. There are very rare exceptions that get caught. But what I was interested in was your use of the estimation of the accuracy of the moves. It depends on the equipment that you're using to assess that. How powerful your computer is, what software you're using, and how long you let it run for. Because normally I have a fairly good setup for that, and I can run a game for an hour and get quite a different result to the result I got after 10 minutes. So I think that would potentially significantly affect your assessment of the strength of the moves. So, and given the vast quantity you were doing, I was just concerned that you weren't running it for very long.
Yeah. Well, what we did was, I haven't mentioned that it's a presentation at the beginning, you are right. And we are asking a stockfish version. I don't remember the concrete version, but it shouldn't be important. The important point is we use the same engine, and we let's make predictions for, I think, about 20 moves ahead, finding the optimal move there. And yeah, it was quite a challenge to do so. I think the calculation of all optimal moves for all those 40 million moves they had took about 9 months in total, maybe 10 months. So I think Julia even killed one of her computers for trying to run everything there. But yeah, it was quite a long computational power necessary, or quite strong computational power and quite a lot of time to do all those calculations. Yeah. Okay, thank you for the comment regarding the reputation of players. You are, of course, right with that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Alex.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Just a question. When they play, being in the shelter is not a nice experience, so people maybe want to do something, and then they decide to play chess. Now, when you are in the shelter in Ukraine, from what I saw, there are many people around you. So maybe the result has nothing to do with this cognitive thing, but just the noise of other people is there, so you cannot concentrate, and therefore you perform worse, for example. Could that be?
I wouldn't be too concerned about that, but of course there are other deviations or distractions besides the alarms themselves. But I would expect that this effect should be correlated with the alarms themselves. The more alarms we have, the more people would go to the shelter. And in this case, we would expect the same distraction effect of an alarm, whether people are in the shelter or not. But you're of course right, that's a negative effect I was showing a few slides before during the tournament, and they could be related to that.
Because you show here, I see the last point, alarms increase chess.com activity.
Yeah.
So basically people are looking to do something with themselves. And I'm not sure, and I hope you never experienced being in shelter, but if there are bombs during the night, you just don't go out, you just stay there. So, and then you may have lower correlation between the alarms and being in shelter. You're just there, whether there is an alarm now or for several hours it's quiet.
Thank you. I have to think more about that, but that's a good indicator. Yeah. Mehmet, yeah.
Hello. So I'm not sure if it's the right place to ask, but since someone asked the Stockfish version and everything, so I'm just reading Julia's what posted there as depth 20 Stockfish 14. I mean that's a pretty good depth for especially blitz chess. I think it's also amazing what they have done in terms of collect all this data and these title Tuesday games that they're not analyzed. So I mean it takes really very, very, very long time, and that's a huge depth. But I do have one question, and I think when Julia presented another paper, I made the same comment to her, which is so pretty much every result so far relies on centipede laws. That's not sure if you're familiar, but centipede laws. It's a how to put it this mildly. It's a terrible measure to measure human move quality. The reason is as follows. For example, let's suppose that the position is +6, and if I make a move and the position drops to +4, this means that I'm losing 2 pawns, which is a huge pawn loss from the engine's perspective. However, from human perspective, from winning position, I go to winning position. So it's both positions are winning, and from a human perspective, it's easier to play for me. So from human perspective, there is no loss actually. Whereas a loss from +2 position to 0, it's a huge difference. From the perspective of the engine, is exactly the same loss, centipede loss. But from a human perspective, it's completely different because +2 means winning pretty much, and 0 means it's a draw. So this is a very significant point, I think, and it's possible to from what you have done already from your analysis of centipede losses, it's possible to add more robustness checks, which is there's something that I proposed a couple of years earlier, which is the missed points. You look at the expected losses that corrects for this, from a winning position. If your move ends up with a winning position, then you actually lose 0, not like a very high amount based on the sort of more human interpretable move quality. Yeah, thanks.
We definitely, I have to read your paper. Probably Julia already did and didn't want to bother me with additional analysis. But I will definitely have to read the paper. I still have 2 responses, which hopefully reduce your concern. First of all, when we don't look on centipede loss in the intensity of their move accuracy, but on the probabilities, we see at least the same pattern. So the probability of doing a mistake is increasing. And the same is true for the probability of a blunder, and the blunder is a centipede loss larger 300 in our case. But I think part of it should be solved by the specification we are using, because you are of course right. When you're already in a bad position, having doing a bad move, but still relative or differently. You are in a bad position, but you still can do an optimal move, and the engine would still tell you that you're in a bad position. To account for such things, we always account for the number of moves, the time spent before, and as far as I remember, we also account for the move accuracy of before. I think we try to control for the state of the position before, and we just look on the additional center pawn loss with the new move. That's probably the thing. And by doing so, we would expect that we can at least rule out that the last bad move directly affects the evaluation of your second move, because otherwise we would expect a correlation between every position after you did once a bad move in the, during the game. And in this case, I would probably be really concerned regarding your comment. I still would like to look on your alternative metric for that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just a quick thing. Like blunder probability, error probability still, you know, it slightly helps, but not much because, you know, so this is a blitz game. So there's a lot of variations and there's a lot of crazy things that are happening. And especially center pawn loss is especially bad measure when those fluctuations happen, I would say. So yeah, but yeah, thanks for the, you know, the clarification.
We definitely will work on that. Thank you. Okay. Coming to the last part, well, a few minutes. Coming to the last part of the paper, we saw that people play better chess when they had a lot of alarms during the day over the last days. That's somewhat weird. And we saw that people played more chess when there have been a lot of alarms. And some of our co-authors mentioned that we might have biases in our estimates because of people using chess for coping with stress. So they use stress to focus on a specific task and completely ignore what's going on around them. And I didn't really want to believe that, because it feels like playing something on your phone should be enough distraction from war, alarms, explosions, etc. I just didn't want to believe that, but we actually got some evidence for that. Also, when we talked with this about that with Ukrainian people, also chess players. And here's an example from Anastasia, who argues that whenever she is hearing air alarms and getting stressed by all of this, she just grabs her phone, opens chess.com, the chess.com app, and spiels a few bullet games, which is another form of speed chess. And she wants to use that to concentrate on this specific move, on this task, and ignoring what's going on around her in life. And that's exactly the definition of coping. Yeah, you try to distract yourself from the stress, what's going on there. Well, coping can be a threat to our identification strategy, because when people use chess to cope with the war, the chess setting itself should underestimate the actual cognitive decline, because people are able to calm down and play better than they would do when they are not being able to ignore what's going on. So when this is the case, we wouldn't expect that day alarms have a real effect, but it should be only by night alarms. We see quite strong effect by night alarms. Yeah? So physical exhaustion is something you cannot, even when you are starting coping, you cannot rule that out. It's basically impossible. But we see pretty strong night effects, which is an indicator that there might be a problem. We try to test that, the relevance of coping, by observing changes in tournament behavior. We know from our data, each round of the tournament, about 5% of players are quitting the tournament. We know from Julia's previous work that quitting starts to become particularly strong when people lose the game. So particularly men, and we are talking about chess, let's concentrate among men. men have quite a lot of difficulties to losing games, and the probability of quitting when you are losing a round is quite high. We might be able to check whether the air alarms affect Ukrainians differently or affect Ukrainians and quitting behavior, and this would be an indicator for quitting. And this is actually the case. When we look on the estimate of all alarms, we see that with each additional alarm, the probability of quitting the tournament decreases by 0.1 percentage point. When we account for the fact that people lost the last round and we interact this with alarm, we can show that alarms themselves have no effect on quitting, but alarms decreases quitting the tournament for Ukrainian chess players. So with each additional alarm, when they lost the game, they don't care. They might have quitted the tournament before because of frustration. We talk of each alarm decreases the probability by 0.25 percentage points. The average quitting rate is about 5%, so this is a meaningful effect. We are not talking about one alarm happening a day. We talk about several alarms happening every day. And we see that Ukrainian chess players actually quit the tournament less than other players when there have been a lot of alarms. So that's an indicator that we actually might have a problem with coping with stress. Let's look on the same idea as we did before. Let's look on the effects of alarms shortly before or during the tournament. And we can see that alarms during the tournament decrease the quitting probability of players. Originally, we were somewhat concerned that maybe people do not participate or they stop playing in the tournament because alarms, bad internet connections, etc., makes them quit the tournament, even when they don't want to. But we can see more alarms reduces the probability of quitting during the tournament, which is again a coping indicator. And the same holds as before. The more alarms happening shortly before the tournament, the less likely Ukrainian chess players are actually quitting the tournament, which is a good indicator that the chess setting we are using might underestimate the actually effects of the cognitive burden of war. In Outlook, something we are thinking about right now is related to this coping mechanism. So is it actually a threat to our identification? So have we problems to measure the cognitive burden of war? Or is it maybe an additional instrument which allows us to quasi-experimentally measure the cognitive burden of war? When chess is used for coping, we of course underestimate the actual effect. So we cannot say anything about the exhaustion effect, that's sleep deprivation that happens in any case. But the day effects could be underestimated quite strongly. And as an experimental economist, when I would have the chance to do such an experiment, I would try to take a group of people and randomly remind them of war. So toss a coin and look, okay, I decide the person is reminded about war. That's completely unethical. We would never do that, not even with priming. However, our tournament provides such a setting because we have the tournament has 11 rounds and we have Russian players participating in the tournament. We have random exposure of Ukrainian chess players to Russian chess players. And given that people are paired with the same performance in the round or in the previous rounds of the tournament, we know Russian players participate, but we never know when they are confronted with them. We might be able to use this random exposure to Russian opponents as a quasi-experiment that reminds people about the war and the effect of on its cognitive burden. And when this is actually working, we might be even able to see the cognitive burden of war, even in a setting where we talk about coping, because this random exposure to Russian chess players might be exactly this experimental random variation I would do as an experimental economist to learn about war. Okay, but now I showed you quite a lot of results, and some of them quite preliminary, but the overall pattern, I think, is clear. So our research question is, what are the real-time effects of war on cognitive performance of a civil population? And we learned that day alarms as well as night alarms significantly reduce the cognitive performance of people. The effects are strongest and mostly driven by night alarms. Risk behavior is changing, people use it for coping and so on. So we actually see there is a cognitive burden of war for the civil population, a group which we never have been able to measure before. By now, our results indicate, or analysis indicates, that we have to interpret our results as a lower bound. First of all, because of the coping, it seems to calm down people, improving their performance. And secondly, because of internal migration within Ukraine. As we showed with some of the robustness checks, the effects in the safer havens seem to be much stronger than in the front lines, which is an indicator that we have quite low compliance with our alarms in the front regions and quite strong ones in the safer region, which makes sense that the people who already stayed in the safer regions are probably the most reliable group for us, for our analyzers. But yes, that's it from my side. Thanks for all your attention, and I'm looking forward for any more questions and concerns which could help us to improve our paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I am going to give you a Teams round of applause if I can. There you go. That was a really interesting talk, and you fielded lots of questions along the way. We still have more time for questions and comments off the back of your talk, Patrick. So if anyone in the audience has further questions that they want to ask, please do raise your hand and ask your questions.
Okay, everyone convinced? Perfect.
It seems so, in which case, job done, Patrick.
I'm happy with that.
Kenneth. No, go on, Kenneth. There's still time.
Oh, I guess, yeah. I mean, not to belabor the point, and I guess if Mr. Evans seemed quite convinced, but with the recent moves of chess.com, but as far as I understand, this was only 1% that they've detected as cheating. This was less than 1% in 2023. So yeah, maybe I'm unnecessarily stuck on this point, but for me, from what I've heard, and this is at least from I sat maybe 5 meters away from a very intense chess player at the office in Tübingen, and he was always saying this was an issue with chess.com. So that's why my mind immediately goes to this. And I could see in a case that when there's sirens or potential, I guess, threat, that your probably use of a solver or your time to be able to use some sort of solver goes down significantly. So of course, if you're sitting comfortably in your home, it's no issue. But then maybe once you hear a siren or you're thinking that maybe you have to move quite quickly, then yeah. And as I understand it, it's not continuous use, but even 3, 4, 5 times during a match, it's possible to affect the outcome.
Fair, but for doing it during the games, this would mean they have to start using it from the beginning, don't they? Just to make sure that you're in the complete right position for that. And otherwise, you would have to start the solver and position everything on the board and for the exact position you have in the moment where you need it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, as I said, it's probably fairly minor, but I think it should be partially addressed in some way.
Yes. We definitely will think about that more. Thank you. Okay, Stefan.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about this. I mean, it's a very impressive piece of work. I mean, I'm very impressed, and your robustness tests are really, are really interesting. And there's so much of interest as a kind of a data exercise. But when I think about the fundamental question, does being in a war zone affect your cognitive ability? Yeah. I mean, who would ever even dare to suggest that it wouldn't do that? Surely it must. Mm-hmm. And so then the question is, how are we to treat these results? This is a bit mean, but I mean, I'm always a bit mean, but I mean, this is I have a reputation for being mean. So, but I just wondered how you're going to motivate this in terms of saying, well, okay, now we know war's bad and we know it affects people badly, but we knew that anyway. So what's in that sense, what's the payoff to this paper in terms of knowledge advancement?
First of all, having you being mean during a presentation discussion is great. I don't want you as a referee, but it's perfect to prepare for a referee report. Yeah, my key takeaway is probably that was actually not so extreme for cognitive performance as we would have expected before. I expected we have quite strong effects of cognitive performance, but what we can see is particularly there are effects during the tournament and the 2-3 hours before the tournament. These are the ones stressing people quite strongly, but these are really temporary effects. So the last 2-3 hours matter. It's not about the last week, the last 2-3 weeks, which have a really strong effect. It's mainly a few hours before we measure their cognitive performance, which was quite surprising for me. Related to that, we see really strong night effects and not less from day alarms, unless they are really shortly before it. And I would interpret our results as most effect of cognitive decline is really temporary or driven by night alarms, which I didn't expect. I expected alarms during day. I would run around like a headless chicken for weeks. I'm pretty sure about that. And I'm quite surprised that people seem to get used to it, particularly to the day alarms. That would be probably for me, surprising finding about the burden of war.
Right. So, I mean, I think in that sense, I mean, I think that it sounds to me like the paper's actually, what the paper's really about is about adaptation and about how people adjust to extremes. And so it seems to me like it's like the old thing about how would you be if I cut off both your arms and legs? How would you feel? And most people say, oh, I'd want to die. And actually people who've lost both their arms and legs don't actually want to die. Once they've adapted to it, they're recorded as being just as happy and contented in their lives as the rest of us. So in that sense, I think you're saying that there's this adaptation. But I think it then comes back to my substitution point, is that in some sense, if you say, well, okay, people live in a war zone and they adapt. And I know that, I mean, there actually is quite a common story about war zones, I think, as well. But then you're saying that there's this one area where they don't adapt. Yeah. And that's where I still wonder about the substitution activity, because if they're failing to adapt during the night alarms, which I totally get, makes a lot of sense to me, then I should play less. And the idea that this is a coping mechanism, I can see that's true for a class of people, but we're not all like that. I mean, some of us, yes, might cope by just saying, screw it, I'm gonna play through the alarms and I don't care. But a lot of us say, no, I'm terrified, I'm gonna get out of here, I can't do this. I can't even think under this sort of stress. And so there's going to be different reactions. And so even if this coping thing is a net reaction, I think there's some composition effect about who is being affected by this, I would have thought.
One smaller robustness check or heterogeneity analysis we still did, which might be related to that, is we splitted the Ukrainian players in above median and below median ELO. And the effects were stronger for above median ELO players, which was somewhat surprising for me, but the ones who are usually playing the most precise are the ones mostly affected, most strongest affected by the alarms. But that's currently, I think, the only thing we have directly related to what you have in mind. I haven't thought about the adaptation story too much until now, to be honest, but that's a really important point for us. Thank you.
No, a really interesting paper, though. It was fascinating. Thank you very much. It was really good.
Great. Thanks, Stefan. I think as we've hit 5 minutes to go, I think we'll probably wrap up there and say thank you again, Patrick. Absolutely fascinating talk. Really, really interesting piece of work. Very novel data set. Really interesting findings as well. And obviously wish you all the best as you proceed with the paper towards publication. That concludes for today. So just to say that we will be back again next week. As mentioned, we've got a full schedule through to Christmas now, which is quite nice. Next week, we will have Manuel Arrigo from the University of Lausanne presenting You Better Not Overpraise Your Team, Field Evidence on the Effects of Feedback, Merit and Luck on Elite Soccer. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Patrick. See you all again next week. Have a great weekend.
Next week.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you for having me, Donny.
Thanks for presenting. See you again soon. Bye-bye.